Hello, everyone. My name is Chandrasekhar. I am the CEO and founder of SecPod. Welcome to the SecPod webinar series. Thanks to everyone who have joined us from different parts of the world. I really appreciate your presence. Please do post your questions. We'll be able to answer towards the end of the session. The purpose of today's webinar is to establish, if at all there is a connection between cybercrime, cyber attacks, and vulnerabilities. If this connection is true, then let's see how to strengthen the cybersecurity posture of an organization in order to efficiently remediate those vulnerabilities even before an attackers have a chance to exploit them. Today, I'm joined by Graham Cluley, who's a well-known cybersecurity and cybercrime researcher. I'm pretty excited to have him part of our session today. He's the widely popular Smashing Security podcast. He runs this and also a blogger series as well. So over to Graham to introduce, or rather try and establish this fact between the vulnerabilities and the cyber crime. So Graham, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. And thank you for that great introduction. And hello, everyone. Thank you for coming along to the webinar today. A real pleasure to talk to you all about vulnerabilities. And you know what? We've got a lot to worry about these days. Yes, obviously, all of us are worried about the big things like climate change, like war, like the cost of living crisis. But if, like me, you work in cybersecurity, the chances are that you're also worried about your company being hacked. And, well, hackers might be trying to steal all kinds of sensitive data from your organization. They may be trying to grab your customer database, your intellectual property. They might be attempting to spy on your email communications. Perhaps they're planning to plant ransomware on your systems and extort millions of dollars of Bitcoin from you. But whatever it is that they plan to do, once they've gained access, they have to break into your organization first before they can do anything else. And one of the ways in which hackers may gain a foothold in your infrastructure is by exploiting a vulnerability. So, what should you do about this? You don't want your company to be hacked. You want to make sure that the hackers aren't able to exploit any vulnerabilities on your network under your watch. You want to know about every vulnerability that might exist in your company's infrastructure so that you can stamp it out and help prevent malicious hackers from gaining access. But here's a problem. Because there are so many vulnerabilities vying for our attention. In 2022 alone, it said that there was 25,000 new vulnerabilities officially identified. That's around 70 every single day, 365 days a year. So this isn't a problem that's getting smaller. It's getting bigger every day. And as networks become more complex, as your staff bring in new software to do their work and plug in new hardware to get their jobs done, they are potentially introducing new risks as well and new headaches. It feels like you're at the bottom of a mountain and you have to reach the top. You're looking up and you can see that you've got a long way to climb. And on top of all that, there's this avalanche of vulnerabilities which might be able to hit you. Everywhere you look, there are holes. What are the chances that you know about every one of those vulnerabilities and know how it might or might not impact your company? How do you even remember that many vulnerabilities? Because remember, most of them have really boring names, like CVE 2014-0160. What good is a name like that to anybody? It's hardly memorable. I wonder if you even remember what vulnerability that is. And sure, there are some people who get excited about CVE numbers. There are some people who might stay up late at night, memorizing the intimate details of vulnerabilities, cataloging their numbers under the bed sheets. But it's hardly memorable, is it? So Maybe you know it by this name instead, Heartbleed. Okay, now we're talking. This is getting a bit sexier. The geek has pulled out his 5¼ inch floppies containing Windows 2.0, and he's sat saucily on his desk. Heartbleed, of course, was the vulnerability that gave sysadmins palpitations back in 2014. When it was discovered, it was possible to exploit the Heartbleed flaw to leak millions of passwords, expose private SSL keys from vulnerable web servers. That's what I call a sexy vulnerability with a sexy name. But you know what? I reckon we can turn up the heat even more by adding a logo. Oh yeah, now I've got your attention, right? This is what we like. And here we have a young Bill Gates curling up with his CRT monitor. I think we can all agree that Heartbleed started a trend for marketing departments of security companies to come up with sexy names and even logos for the vulnerabilities that their analysts uncover. And of course, there was this spate of new vulnerabilities coming along: Heartbleed, Meltdown, Cable Haunt, Shell Shock, Smack, Cloudbleed, Image Track, Dirty Cow, Stage Fright, eFail, Acropolis, oh my God, Spectre, Drown, Alpaca Ghost. You get the idea. Marketing departments were really, really busy. Suddenly, any vulnerability worth its salt had to have a logo, had to have a website. These are the bugs which made the headlines. They've got cool names, they've got websites, they may even have a theme tune. They are, in short, really darn sexy, which is all great for raising awareness of those vulnerabilities. But sometimes it meant that those with the best names, the vulnerabilities with the really sexy names, were given more attention than they deserved compared to the vulnerabilities which, how boring, didn't have a cool logo. Take a look, for instance, at OWASP's top 10. This is the top 10 most critical security concerns for web application security. It's all broken access control and SQL injection attacks and cryptographic failures. It's not sexy at all. And this sexiness issue is a significant problem because the bugs with the media-friendly logos aren't the ones, well, they aren't the only ones we need to fix, because they're not the only ones being exploited by malicious hackers. And with so many vulnerabilities, how do you prioritize what hole needs to be plugged first? This is a challenge, and organizations are facing this challenge. First of all, there's the sheer scale of the vulnerability problem. Like I mentioned, 25,000 new vulnerabilities discovered last year, over 70 every day. And a vulnerability doesn't have to be a software vulnerability. It can also be a misconfiguration. And these are just the vulnerabilities we know about. There are vulnerabilities that can lurk unseen, unnoticed for literally years, that could be exploited by malicious hackers at any time. A lot of people cling on to the belief that if software is open source, if the code can be checked, that it's somehow guaranteed immune. It's guaranteed any bugs in that open source code will be stamped out quickly because they'll be found quickly because anyone can look at the code. And yet, time and time again, we discover that is not the case. You see, the time between a vulnerability being introduced into software and it finally being discovered inside the software can be extraordinarily long. Here's some examples. Heartbleed, which we mentioned earlier. That bug was present for over 2 years before anyone noticed and did anything about it. And if you thought Heartbleed's discovery took a long time, then I've got news for you. Shell Shock, a vulnerability in the Unix bash shell, wasn't found for 15 years. 15 years! That's older than my son. And Poodle, a problem with SSL 3.0, that went unnoticed for 18 years. 18 years we thought SSL 3.0. Okay, that's all right. There was a vulnerability called Poodle in it. It's obviously not good that it can take years for a software vulnerability to be found. But it's even worse when post-discovery, companies can still take forever to patch against a problem. The problem is compounded by a lack of network visibility, not knowing what is connected to your infrastructure. In many cases, organizations have no idea about how many assets they have, how many computers they have, how many devices, let alone where they are all located. In any organization, it's normal for different devices, on or off premises, wired or wireless, to be constantly added or removed. And this can present an opportunity, a real opportunity for malicious hackers to take advantage of systems that contain vulnerabilities or misconfigurations. So you always want to know what is attached to your network, whether it could be vulnerable or not. And you want to know what your staff might be plugging into your systems. That is a lesson that Iran's nuclear program discovered to its cost. Someone at the Natanz nuclear facility plugged in a USB stick when they really shouldn't have plugged in an unauthorized USB stick. On that USB stick was the Stuxnet malware, which exploited a software vulnerability to infect systems at the uranium enrichment facility at Natanz, and ultimately caused a series of major technical problems for the site's centrifuges. It caused physical damage. That was done to Iran's nuclear program, that damage, by what at the time was considered the most sophisticated malware ever seen, exploiting a vulnerability to jump the air gap and do its dirty work. Well, who could have been responsible for such a nasty piece of malware? Is it a cybercrime gang living under a volcano? Is it a chapter of motorcycle riding Hell's Angels? No, it was these guys, with a little help from their friends. Yes, it was later discovered that the US Obama administration, working with the Israelis, were behind the cyber attack, which got out of control and accidentally infected other computers elsewhere in the world, drawing attention to itself. That's why we know about it. But it's not just the West who are behind cyber attacks exploiting vulnerabilities, of course. Take a look at these chaps here. According to the United States, these four men were all members of China's People's Liberations Army, the hacking unit at the PLA called the 54th Research Institute. They're now some of the most wanted people by the FBI. They are accused of engaging in a 3-month-long campaign, which saw the sensitive personal information of more than 150 million Americans, Canadians, and British stolen from this company, Equifax. Information stolen included social security numbers, addresses, birth dates, driver's license details, credit card information. The FBI described it at the time as the largest theft of sensitive, personally identifiable information by state-sponsored hackers ever recorded. But Equifax's problems didn't end there. The men were also accused of stealing trade secret information, such as Equifax's data compilations, their database designs. Now, it's probably never easy to keep a determined state-sponsored attacker out of your organization, but Equifax was found to have done a pretty poor job of securing its network. After the breach was disclosed, it was revealed that the company had made a number of major security lapses. For instance, using admin, just the word admin, as a username and as a password as well. Not a great choice. But Equifax's investigation into the breach also found that the hackers had exploited a vulnerability in Apache Struts, CVE 2017-5638, if you're counting, was the name of the vulnerability. It was a vulnerability in its online dispute web portal, which was done in order to access personal information. The data was exfiltrated via the vulnerability between May and July 2017. Now, what's awkward is that vulnerability had been made public months earlier, in early March 2017, meaning Equifax could have patched against the flaw in a timely fashion, but they didn't do it. Equifax admitted that it had been aware of the vulnerability, but for some reason had failed to patch its vulnerable systems. And this obviously caused a nightmare for Equifax and for the public at large. The attack was particularly significant for some of Equifax's staff. Equifax's chief information officer and also the CSO, they were, quote, retired with immediate effect. And shockingly, some of Equifax's staff were later found guilty of insider trading before the breach was made public. They took advantage of the fact that they knew there was very bad news for the company around the corner. They knew about the breach, so they traded their shares in order that they made money rather than lost money, helped them make profitable decisions with their share portfolio. Well, that's Equifax, but here's a nightmare for another organization. It looks harmless enough, but it's what a nightmare can actually look like. This is a GitHub repository used by developers at this company. These are the offices of a company called SolarWinds, a $5 billion company that manages the network infrastructure for everybody, absolutely everybody, including over 425 of the US Fortune 500, the top 10 US telecoms companies, all branches of the US military, the Department of Justice, the President's Office, Microsoft, Intel, Google, the list goes on and on. SolarWinds has lots of big companies as customers. And the problem with their GitHub repository was that it was public. And it was public to the whole world. And inside the code on that GitHub repository was a hard-coded plain text password for one of the company's update servers. What was the password? SolarWinds 123. Arguably not a great password. A company that had its GitHub repository misconfigured allowed hackers to gain access to its code, which calamitously contained a hard-coded plaintext password. A vulnerability, as I said before, doesn't have to be a software vulnerability. It can also be a misconfiguration. So what did SolarWinds do when news of this broke? They blamed it on the interns. How convenient. Now, I went onto the net to see if I could find out who it was. What do you know? I found a webpage all about SolarWinds' intern program. It's all very positive and fabulous, although they don't mention that they might blame me for things when things go wrong. Predictably, the cybersecurity community had a good old laugh at the password fiasco, and memes popped up on social media. But we shouldn't laugh too much, because I'd not be surprised if many other companies are making similarly poor decisions themselves. So once the Chinese hackers broke into SolarWinds, it wasn't so much that they now had a password to an update server at SolarWinds, but what they did with it. They created a malicious software update. That malware they called Sunburst, and this was a software supply chain attack. Sunburst was injected into the SolarWinds build process. It intercepted the build process. It ran when the source code was being compiled. And then afterwards in the process, it confirmed it had been audited. Sunburst swapped the original source code with its own malicious code at the precise point where it was about to be compiled into machine code, thus avoiding detection. It was then injected into an update for SolarWinds, which was made available to customers. And after that, the malware waited maybe a couple of weeks before doing anything malicious. And when it triggered, it disabled all of those customers' antivirus and forensic security tools in order to stay undetected. And then it started looking for other vulnerabilities on the network to exploit. As many as 18,000 of SolarWinds' corporate customers were affected by this. They installed the malicious updates and were now compromised with a remote access Trojan. And the hackers hung around undetected for around about 9 months, able to gain access to data and email accounts. This is, of course, a supply chain attack. And in recent years, software supply chain attacks have continued to evolve. Proliferation of open source software, third-party dependencies has introduced new challenges for organizations. Because if a malicious hacker compromises a software company's updates, they can inject malware into the company's customers' computers as well. So supply chain attacks can introduce vulnerabilities into your organization. And of course, the consequences of a supply chain attack, they can vary. Some are more obvious than others. Here's one which I saw. Bad news if you wanted to eat chicken wings and cheesy crust pizza, because this particular business got hit by ransomware. And ransomware continues to be one of the main ways that cyber criminals make money, increasing their demands by infecting more and more PCs in your infrastructure through the exploitation of vulnerabilities in your organization. And then, of course, they put these data which they steal up for ransomware, up for ransom. So they're extorting money from you. Vulnerabilities, a big headache. So you'd be wrong to think this vulnerability problem is not serious. And it's a mistake to think that it has to be a 0-day vulnerability that vendors haven't yet created a fix for. It's all kinds of vulnerabilities. The truth is that old vulnerabilities can also be exploited if you haven't patched or mitigated against them. Doesn't have to be a 0-day vulnerability that causes your company to fall victim to hackers. An old vulnerability can also be exploited if it hasn't been patched against. So don't leave things poorly configured like this GitHub repository. So why are all these attacks? Why are they all happening? It's a very simple explanation for that. Cybercrime is big business today. And the bad guys are literally making millions, in some cases, hundreds of millions. And the impact is very real. And the damage to the reputation of your business and corporate brands is potentially enormous. Clint Eastwood, when he was Dirty Harry, famously asked, are you feeling lucky, punk? And maybe the IT chiefs at companies around the world need to ask themselves a similar question every morning. Will today be the day that they suffer a data breach or learn their systems being compromised by hackers who've encrypted their servers because they didn't know about a vulnerability on their systems? I'm afraid it's not a question of if you will get hacked. It's rather more a question of when you will get hacked, because you will get hacked to some extent or another. There'll be some kind of security incident. It's more a question of how you do it. It's just a question of how serious the hack is that you suffer, whether hackers succeed in stealing your data, what damage they might do to your infrastructure and reputation, and what you might be rolling out to your customers down that software supply chain. The answer is to harden your security, perform regular automated scans to discover what assets are connected to your infrastructure, and enumerate any vulnerabilities that may be present. Make sure that you're taking the threat of vulnerabilities seriously to prevent your company being the next victim. Thank you very much. And I'll hand over now for the next section of the webinar. Cheers.
Thank you, Graham, for powerfully establishing a connection between the vulnerabilities and the cyber attacks or cyber crimes. You also covered you also helped us establish another fact that it is not just a software vulnerability, but it's also the misconfiguration. It can be human stupidity in some of the cases that you covered, going through array of cyber attacks that we have seen in the recent past. Thank you for doing that. So, very imperative that every attacker leverages some sort of a weakness that is present in the IT infrastructure that we are trying to safeguard. Those vulnerabilities that are widely open is what attackers are all after. So preventing these cyber attacks requires that proactive assessment and understanding of these vulnerabilities. Typically, what we see in the real world is that investments going into reactive security, or as I call late stage security, neglecting the proactive security that could really help organizations prevent cyber attacks. Typically, we would invest in firewalls, EDR, XDR, SIM solutions, log analysis solutions, etc. The intention there is to identify these active threats or potential attacks and preventing those attacks. The challenge is similar to like playing a whack-a-mole game on a large board, and these moles are popping out frequently, and it is almost impossible to kind of sustain or you kind of give up to the fatigue, and that is how cyber criminals are able to breach into the organization's IT infrastructure. So typically what we see is the three different types of weaknesses that, if you may categorize them into. So some are technological weaknesses, whether it is the software vulnerabilities or the misconfigurations and other forms of vulnerabilities that may be present in the infrastructure. It can be people weakness as well, as we saw, and it can be process weaknesses. So these are the kinds of vulnerabilities that can be there, which attackers are trying to exploit. So it goes without saying that it's sort of a well-known understanding. It's important to understand, assess your IT infrastructure against these vulnerabilities and apply measures to fix them before an attackers have opportunity to exploit them. So that is an important point that I'm making here. It is important to identify these vulnerabilities and fix these vulnerabilities before an attacker could exploit these weaknesses. So this is where it becomes kind of interesting. It is important to detect timely, mitigate timely. That time is a crucial factor. The challenge in implementing such a vulnerability management program is the tools ecosystem is not really supportive enough. So traditionally, vulnerability management was depicted this way: identify the vulnerability, assess vulnerabilities, prioritize vulnerabilities, remediate them, and report them. There's nothing wrong with this representation. Everything seems to be tied in, seems to work seamlessly. But in actual, this is definitely not the case when we have this, whenever we begin to implement a vulnerability management program within the IT infrastructure. So as we learned, vulnerabilities go beyond CVEs. It's not just the software vulnerabilities. It can be misconfigurations. It can be any other form of weakness that vulnerability, the attackers are after. And each of these layers or the phases in the vulnerability management program kind of operate in silo. None of these work in a unified, integrated fashion, because each of these are powered by point solutions. Each of them work independently, not seamlessly integrated. Typically, when we take up a task to perform a vulnerability assessment, use any vulnerability scanner, you run a scan. That scan runs for a few days together, and maybe within 2 weeks to 3 weeks period, you have a vulnerability report that runs into thousands of pages. Now, as a security administrator, you will have to understand each of these vulnerability, identify what is the fix that I can apply, and then go ahead and use multiple different products to remediate these vulnerabilities. The stats say that organizations end up spending 3 to 5 months after detecting the vulnerabilities to mitigate it. So the challenge number one is the amount of time that we are taking to detect these vulnerability, and the challenge number two is, of course, mitigating these vulnerability. It hardly matters you know about a vulnerability, but you have not acted upon that vulnerability. It does not really help there. So it's important to have the mitigation in place, but we are spending up to 5 months to discover these vulnerabilities and mitigate them. Imagine a 0-day vulnerability that is published somewhere by a security researcher, and then you have to have a task of identifying whether your infrastructure is affected by that vulnerability. And then you take 5 weeks to identify such vulnerability. It is hardly useful. So that is where the problem is. So unless we implement an effective vulnerability management program, the problems continue to remain widely open, and organizations are subject to such exploitation that Graham talked about. So if I have to summarize that, we don't know if we have discovered all kinds of vulnerability. So there's low certainty. You don't know if you have identified all vulnerabilities and if you have mitigated those vulnerabilities, so you don't have control over infrastructure. And this entire process is not continuous and not automated. So because of the siloed interfaces and multiple point products that are there. None of them talk one to the other, so it is not seamless at all. So at SecPod, we have come up with a framework. We call it as Advanced Vulnerability Management Framework. All the phases that we talked about, implementing a vulnerability management program, we have unified into one single platform. From getting visibility into the IT infrastructure on a continuous basis, Graham talked about not knowing what is present within the IT infrastructure. It's extremely important for a cybersecurity personnel to know what is that they are trying to safeguard. So what computing devices are there, who is the participating users, what application stack is running, where is my infrastructure. So all of that is a critical knowledge that I should have. So and this has to be a continuous process. You need to know when at that point in time, not relying on outdated data that your scanner has produced. Once you have that visibility, it's important to normalize the infrastructure. There can be so many surprises that you kind of encounter when you start inspecting your infrastructure. There can be unwanted software, shadow IT. You don't even know what software are being used by the users. Are they supposed to have those privileges, an extra privilege that is given to a particular user or not? So it's important to question those and normalize the infrastructure and then detect the vulnerability. When I say detect the vulnerability, it is not just discovering the software vulnerabilities as described by CVEs, but it's also going beyond software vulnerability into misconfigurations, into anomalies or different kinds of security controls, whether they are functioning or not. And then prioritizing these vulnerability into the actionable sort of a set that you want to start with. So here are the high critical vulnerabilities that I must act upon depending on the infrastructure that you have, the business context or the environmental context. And if that particular vulnerability is being exploited in the wild, obviously that becomes the priority vulnerability that you must act upon. And then feed that information into the remediation engine. So when I say remediation engine, you need to have not just the patch management solution, which helps us update the software. Of course, it is a critical function, but you also need to have the ability to fix misconfigurations. As we saw, admin or SolarWinds 123 is definitely not the password policy that you must have within your organizations. Those are misconfigurations, and those need to be fixed. And going beyond misconfiguration, there can be hundreds of security controls that you can actually apply to eliminate certain vulnerabilities. Maybe there is a 0-day vulnerability and there is no software patch available. You may have some workaround that you can think of applying. So you need to have those additional controls going beyond patches. So I'm talking about holistic remediation here. Once it is remediated, of course, you need to demonstrate whether the remediation is successful and if vulnerabilities are truly eliminated. And this entire process needs to be a continuous process. It cannot be siloed. It cannot be taking number of weeks to understand the vulnerability, months to remediate vulnerability. It needs to be as much automated as possible, making it into a daily routine. So this is the framework that our product implements in our cyber hygiene platform called Sena Now. So we have a tool set to discover the giving visibility into the IT infrastructure, identify posture anomalies and normalize the IT infrastructure, detect vulnerabilities of different kind from software vulnerabilities to misconfigurations, and prioritize these vulnerability through a risk prioritization algorithm, and then feeding that information into the mitigation engine where we have patch management and endpoint management going beyond security patches. So this platform works across heterogeneous IT environment, which is typically what we see in every deployments that we conduct. So that is a quick summary of the platform. Let me take a few minutes to kind of give a glance of what I'm talking about, maybe a quick view of our platform itself. So we talked about visibility, detection, prioritization, and remediation. So this is our primary dashboard. So it gives visibility into the IT infrastructure. So you have visibility into what kind of devices are there, what applications are there any outdated applications present, how many users are connected, different flavors of operating system that is present. And you get a cyber hygiene score, sort of representing how hygienic your environment is. Of course, closer to 100 is the best, better. In this particular case, it is not. And then when you go into the detection layer, we detect software vulnerabilities, misconfiguration, posture anomalies, and missing security patches. This information is fed into our prioritization engine, so which categorizes these vulnerability into four sort of buckets. So these are vulnerabilities that you must act upon immediately. These are vulnerabilities that you can prioritize or advance the remediation cycle beyond your regular patching cycle. Then track star is something that you can apply patches as part of your regular patching interval. Track is something that you can keep it under watch. So these prioritized information is fed into our remediation engine, which helps mitigate all of these vulnerabilities within the same console. So all four stages of vulnerability management coming into one single platform, represented through or supported by these different products. Each of them, of course, have a dashboard of their own, giving you detailed visibility into the IT infrastructure, how many devices are there, what kinds of devices are there, what software components are present in that infrastructure. Are there any outdated application, blacklisted applications? All of this information is continuously presented because the scans are running every day. You're getting visibility every day in an automated fashion, and you know what is present in your infrastructure um, almost in real time. Then we have a posture anomaly product. So all the data that we gather from every point, every devices that are participant in the IT infrastructure, we sort of do a statistical anomaly computation to uncover um, certain kinds of vulnerability that the IT security administrators typically don't have visibility into. Let's look at this particular anomaly. For example, it identified that there are several unwanted services that are installed within the organization without the approval. Uh, that's one simple example, but there are hundreds of such anomalies that our platform is able to automatically detect and identify such vulnerabilities. And not only detect these vulnerability, but we have also integrated the remediation component. So you can actually go ahead and fix these specific issues to eliminate those vulnerabilities instantly. And then going into the vulnerability management part, you uncover all the software vulnerabilities across your heterogeneous environment. So these many vulnerabilities were identified in a few systems. You get visibility into what vulnerabilities are there and are there high critical vulnerabilities that you must act upon immediately. So that kind of visibility you get within the vulnerability management component. And then we have a compliance management. This is an interesting tool to identify misconfigurations that are present within the infrastructure. So there are various benchmarks, NIST benchmarks, CIS, STIG, so or industry regulation benchmarks like PCI, HIPAA, NHS, etc. So we could create a benchmark, assess all the devices against this benchmark, identify misconfigurations, and fix these misconfigurations within the same platform. This process can be completely automated. So you're running a scan every day. Any configuration drifts that occurs, it can be automatically fed into the remediation engine. It'll go ahead and fix that particular drift. So you can be ensured that your devices are always compliant to a particular benchmark or a baseline. Going into the risk prioritization, now that we have detected vulnerabilities, it's important to prioritize these vulnerabilities as well. So we have risk prioritization product that takes all these discovered vulnerabilities as input and applies CISA's SSVC framework to prioritize these vulnerabilities into 4 different categories, as I mentioned: act, attend, track star, and track. And this information is fed into the remediation engine, and you can go ahead and fix those vulnerabilities within the same platform. Let me move into the remediation part. So we have patch management covering the heterogeneous environment, whether it's Windows, Linux, or Mac, or third-party applications that you want to effectively remediate. So the important thing that you see in the patch management product is this connection. So there are 5,000 plus vulnerabilities on 4 devices that you can roll out 320 patches to effectively eliminate all of these vulnerabilities. And all that it takes is to go into missing patches, select those patches that you want to deploy, and go ahead and apply those security patches. All of this can be achieved in real time, integrated fashion, and you can also automate this process. So any new vulnerabilities identified, a patch is available, you go ahead and deploy the patches. It runs an automated vulnerability scan. It'll verify if that vulnerability is eliminated, and instantly you can come back to VM and see if those vulnerabilities are actually remediated or not. So going beyond patch management is the endpoint management component that has several actions that you can roll out. So let's say there is an unwanted service and you want to stop the service, you can go ahead and stop it right here. You want to quarantine this particular system to a separate network, you can go ahead and do that. If you want to edit the registries to apply some workarounds that you may be aware of for a particular vulnerability, you can roll out those. If there are unwanted applications present, you can block those applications or uninstall those applications. So there are hundreds of such actions that you can apply within the platform to effectively eliminate all of these vulnerabilities. So to summarize, you have visibility, detection of different kinds of vulnerability, prioritizing these vulnerabilities, and mitigating these vulnerabilities within the same platform is now possible with our platform, Sena now. All right, that concludes our session. Over to any questions that you may have from our audience. So let me read out some of those. Once vulnerability is known to security teams, what is the best strategy to fight attacks, defense, or offense? Graham, I think that is to you.
I'm not a fighter. I'm a lover, man. I'm not. You don't ever want me on your side if you need someone punched. So for me, I don't really understand the question, to be honest. I think it's all about defending. When it comes to a vulnerability, you don't always know who to attack back, but you have to understand who your attacker is, I suppose, or at least how they're attacking you. So if there is a vulnerability in your system, good to patch it, good to mitigate the impact of that vulnerability if at all possible. So get as much information as you can about how it's affecting your organization and what the impact may be so that you can best defend your data and your employees and your clients.
All right, thank you. So moving on to the next one, what if there is a vulnerability in vulnerability management tool? So I think Graham took the example of SolarWinds. So SolarWinds is an IT management software, not a vulnerability management tool, but that is what is the supply chain attack that Graham talked about. If there is a vulnerability that is present within the tool that is helping us safeguard, you have to treat it as equal as any other vulnerability. You need to fix that vulnerability, work with your tool suppliers to eliminate that vulnerability as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I mean we're only human, us programmers, aren't we? There are bugs inevitably in code. Nobody uses version 1.0 of a piece of software because it's perfect and there was never any need to update it. So a vulnerability management tool, you need to keep it up to date. If there is a problem with it, you roll out the update to it, just like you would with any other piece of software, really. Um, and like I said, we're human. People make mistakes. If you really want something to screw something up, then you get ChatGPT to write the code for you instead. So better, I think, this way with us humans writing the code rather than robots doing it for us.
Yeah, so there's no guarantee though that the chat GPT will produce secure code. Yeah, but that is probably better. I mean, human mistakes can be eliminated, hopefully. All right. There's one more point. Graham talked about emerging supply chain attacks. What is the best way for security teams to defend against such attacks?
Well, one things that I'm hearing about from organizations is they're putting much more demands on their suppliers and the vendors who are producing software for them, for instance, and other things, to make sure that they have their own house in order and that they're properly hunting down vulnerabilities and mitigating attacks and segmenting their networks and doing all the best practices, which hopefully the people tuned into this webinar are doing as well. Has that been your experience as well? Are you seeing that more of your clients are actually asking difficult questions of their suppliers and saying that they need to have the best protection in place too?
For sure. I think the supply chain attack is kind of, you know, helped create that awareness among all of the customers. They're really asking difficult questions. They're really asking certifications from the vendor. Have you done penetration testing on your own product? Have you perform a deeper analysis of source code vulnerabilities? Are you SOC 2 certified? So all kinds of questions are definitely coming in. So that is really a positive development in my view. All right. So question for Graham, you're popular. What do you see the biggest gap between the enterprise infosec and IT teams today? Where are they struggling in preventing cyber attacks?
Oh, where are organizations struggling? I think it's all manner of different struggles which you're having if you work in IT security. One is that you may not have the proper backing of your board. There may not be enough funding for your part of the company. I'd hope that's less and less the case because we're constantly seeing more headlines about companies being hacked. So I hope that you're being given the resources. But I think many of us working in cybersecurity are overworked. We're working long hours. Inevitably, we can make mistakes. We might want some more backup to assist us to do the job properly. In terms of things which are getting overlooked, it's a sort of step aside in some ways from vulnerabilities, but certainly the avalanche of vulnerabilities is an issue. But another area where I think is often overlooked is the insider threat. I think a lot of companies are very focused on external attackers. And the truth is, there's also a considerable problem of people coming into your organization. You may even give them passwords to access databases. And what are those people going to do? Could they be extorted? Could they be bribed into doing bad things? Are they disgruntled in their job and going off somewhere else? Could they be taking your data with them when they leave? So, yeah, I'd say think about insiders as well and rogue agents inside your company.
Yes. Next question. Yeah, I think. What are your thoughts on alternative means, that is compensating controls of remediation? There are often many very real reasons why systems cannot be patched quickly or ever if older systems.
Oh, I think you might answer that one better than
Yeah,
me. You may have more experience than that.
I'll take that in. Certainly, I think so. Typically in the organization, so you'll have the end user computing, you have the server infrastructure, which may be running production load. So you can't be applying blindly all the fixes that are made available by the vendors. So that can have some dependency. It may end up breaking some of the production load that is supposed to be running at all times. So the fixing mechanism cannot be universally applied across all kinds of different, all kinds of devices that are there within the infrastructure. Of course, production load must be handled slightly differently. You may want to kind of create a replica and then patch it, test it, make sure that those patches are working before rolling out those patches into the production environment. But at the same time, we need to ensure that this is done timely. Especially the production load is typically exposed to the internet. It's not like internal systems that are never connected to the internet. So timely fixing is important. At the same time, testing and ensuring that these production load continues to work as they were working before is important too. But when you go into end user computing, it may be kind of all right to go ahead and roll out these fixes quickly, because you will have some recovery mechanism available within the tool sets. For example, in our own tool set, there is a rollback available. So any change that you make can be rolled back to the previous state. So this kind of provides some sort of an assurance that even if something were to go wrong, you can always get back to the previous state. All right, so I see one last question. Can I get the recorded version after this? Yes, certainly. We will be sending out an email to everyone who are part of the session. We will also publish this live on our Bright Talk channel as well. So this will be available forever in that particular channel. All right. Any final thought from you, Graham?
Yeah, everyone, go and get patched. Go and prioritize your vulnerabilities right now. Don't sleep. Work until Christmas. Don't delay. Do those 24. Seriously, stay safe out there, folks. It's a bit of a jungle.
Right. Thank you, Graham. Wonderful having you here. Thanks to all of the audience who were with us today. Hopefully, you found it useful. As Graham mentioned, identify the vulnerabilities and fix them as quickly as possible, because every attacker leverages these weaknesses that are present in the infrastructure. So timely action can save your infrastructure from cyber attacks. Thank you, folks. Wonderful.
Thank you.
Time spending here. Good. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.